Hey everybody, welcome back to Leosophy. This is the third in the Prepper series, and I knew from the get-go that the first three episodes were going to be the three things that people focus on in the rule of threes, which is to say that you can't go 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, 3 hours without shelter. And I think that's something that people who've never heard that before, they hear for the first time, they get kind of hung up on. They think, what? 3 hours without shelter? No. I could go a long time without shelter. What are you talking about? Shelter doesn't just mean a house. You can die a lot faster without any shelter, more so than anything else, because think about the elements and what we do in response to them. If it gets really hot, we go towards the shade, right? Or someplace where it's not so hot. When it's really cold, we go someplace warm. When it's raining, we go someplace dry. You see how that works? Shelter is a place where you can acclimate without damaging your health. It doesn't just mean a house. And it's very easy, just being outside, going outside, and doing things to think, well, I don't need shelter in 3 hours. Well, what if there's a hailstorm? What if there's a blizzard? What if there's a heat wave? What if there's thunder and lightning? Those are things that are much more pressing than the acquisition of food and water. So that's why shelter is that important. And there are some really basic components to shelter that people often don't think about. Great example. There was a couple who got lost. They were driving through Pacific Northwest, if I remember right, and their GPS malfunctioned, and they got lost in some sort of park. And within a couple hours, they were dead. And their autopsies purported that they had died from exposure. The temperature outside was about 68 degrees. So think about that. That's a very comfortable temperature, and yet these two people died of exposure within hours. What had happened connects to shelter, not in the sense of having a roof over your head, not in the sense of four walls. What had happened was, being very tired, they went to sleep on the ground. What a lot of people may not be aware of is that if you go to sleep on the ground, and the ground is quite a bit colder than your body temperature, it will simply start leaching the heat away from you. That's the nature of the universe. Everything moves towards where it is more lacking until some sort of equilibrium is maintained. So people being warmer than the ground, and the ground being much bigger than a person, just leaches the warmth away. This is something even gorillas understand. Even though they live in much warmer areas, they actually make bedding out of leaves, not just because it's more comfortable, but because going to sleep on the ground under certain circumstances, like if the ground is wet, for example, and that's, Pacific Northwest, think about that. It's often wet. It's going to wick away a person's heat. Water always does this, incidentally. Water is always going to pull your body heat away from you. It's why plane crashes over bodies of water can be so dangerous, even in relatively warm weather, because even if people manage to stay afloat and not drown, unless you're dealing with water that's actually warmer or almost as warm as a person, like the ocean, on a good day, it will eventually pull a person's body heat away enough to give them hypothermia, and they die from exposure. And that's really what shelter is all about. It's about not getting exposure. Not, for the most part, it's about hypo or hyperthermia, overheating from too much direct sunlight and hot conditions, or more often freezing because of really not even necessarily like sub-zero temperatures, as we just went over. It can be a simple matter of room temperature, but moisture on the ground or some other, being wet from rain, etc., can leach a person's body heat to the point that they have hypothermia and they die. So what kinds of shelter does a person need? The most basic shelter isn't even really shelter. It's something between you and the ground, some sort of barrier, waterproof preferably, like a sleeping bag. Another thing would just be a simple lean-to with leaves and grass and twigs being used as a barrier between you and the ground. So that's the first thing. When people think of shelter, they usually think of a roof, but really, you need more protection from what's under you, more so than what's over you. The roof comes second, and it should be implemented in any shelter. A lean-to often incorporates, in addition to a bedding of natural materials, but also usually a sort of a slant propped up against a tree or some brush of larger branches to the point that it can block, and often leaves placed over that to block out excess sunlight and, even more importantly, rain. So that's the basic. Like, forget everything in terms of creature comforts. That's bare minimum what a person needs to survive the day, not to even consider a week from now or 2 weeks from now, or in the case of needing water, 3 days. So yeah, shelter absolutely should be priority number one in a scenario. And that's what leads to a big conflict that people often have within communities of people who prepare. Should you bug out or bug in? That's a big common one, because a lot of people in said communities, they focus on bug out. And I think that a lot of that is pop culture, that preppers show, which I really think the whole reason why that show exists is to discourage people from being prepared for anything at all, period. They always show the most insane human being whose behavior, mannerisms, reasons for being prepared, and means of getting ready for things are just so far removed from what an ordinary person could find relatable that it really discourages them from being involved at all. Which is sad because, again, as I mentioned in every other video, this is not about getting ready for, World War II electric boogaloo. This is about getting ready for an earthquake or a hurricane or massive power failure or just anything. Very broad consequences, very broad negative scenarios that you should be ready for. Like, it doesn't have anything to do with your ideology. In terms of shelters, obviously bugging in would be better than, the problem there is being too attached to location. And we see this in every major conflict. Whenever things get really bad to the point where there needs to be refugees, where people need to run, there's always going to be people who are crippled by the idea of leaving everything behind. They've invested too much, etc., and so they stay and they die. So a hybrid approach is absolutely the best approach. You should always be flexible. You should be like a kite string. You shouldn't be too rigid about, well, if something bad happens, we're leaving right now. You're going to leave all those resources, all those nice things that you already have, shelter, to take a risk because you bought that fancy bag and stocked it with stuff. Conversely, we're staying put no matter what. That's not always an option. I mean, it's an option, but it's an option that could kill you. So be ready for both scenarios. Have a place, have a location. And incidentally, bugging in doesn't have to mean staying home. You could have a secondary location that nobody even knows about. In fact, it's better if fewer people know about it, that you can just, F off to if things happen. That's always on the table if you have the means of acquiring something like that. In fact, most people I know who are in that sort of mindset, who live in urban settings, they acquire resources because they live in an urban area, but they also have a rural place in case things go bad. And again, most of these things, you don't have to be firmly entrenched in something where if somebody found out they'd think you were crazy because, that same rural area, you don't have to introduce it as, oh, that's the place I'm going to go if Jesus comes back. No, you don't have to. It could be your place where you want to retire someday when you're done wanting to acquire resources. It could be something that you have for hunting or as a hobby. You see how that works? It doesn't have to be solely devoted to that. In fact, very few things in your possession that you acquire should have to directly relate to being prepared. Like I mentioned about the pantry game, having a good pantry stuff. That's not necessarily because the world might end tomorrow. That's just smart, period. So similarly, that goes double for shelter because, tents or a shelter, but they can be used for camping. Unless you're buying an underground bunker somewhere, it can just be a normal part of your life. It doesn't have to consume this fixation on being ready. It can be a tertiary component that is useful in one way when things are good and is useful in a completely different way when things are bad. So that's just something to consider. Yeah, that's all for the shelter episode. Like, share, subscribe, keep asking questions. Bye.